What are you trying to tell me? That I can dodge bullets?
No, Neo. I'm trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. It's time to talk about another comic book career retrospective. This week, we're talking about Mark Millar. Damn it, Perch, you got me again. He's always got me saying the wrong name. Now, what's interesting, last week we talked about Todd McFarlane, which I would say his career, like, you could not replicate that even if you tried to. Like, the way that his career worked, the fact that he ends up, after he leaves the Big Two, he focuses on a singular project and makes Spawn one of the most enduring independent comic creators of all time, the most enduring independent comic series of all time, and really focuses on that. Whereas Mark Millar is certainly, I think, the new game plan for comic book creators in the modern times. I imagine Joe's going to have something to say about that as well as Brig. Obviously, with us is my good friend, award-winning comic book editor Joe Crawler. How you doing, Joe?
I'm all right, Wes. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. How about you, Brain? How you doing? The voice of the voiceless, the man so cool they called him the Breen. I forgot to introduce you in the last video. My goodness, I feel stupid.
If they don't know who we are by now, probably not watching this. So.
I'm
doing all right too.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. So when we see what's going on with Substack, and then people are using kind of the Big Two to launch themselves and get a bigger name and a bigger following, and then trying to venture out and create their own IP that translates to other mediums. Really, they're following the Mark Millar blueprint that he started like 15, 16 years ago, Joe. Yeah. I imagine you have a lot of friends within the industry. Mm-hmm. You want to be the next Mark Millar?
No, absolutely. A lot of people would like to be the next Mark Millar, but yeah, like we were talking about with Todd, you can't really replicate that career. You equally can't really replicate Mark's career, and they're very different, but they both have led to incredible success. And Mark's very similar to some of the other people that were coming up, in the very end of the 80s into the 90s. It's been said that he had interviewed Grant Morrison when he was coming up. I believe Neil Gaiman interviewed Alan Moore when he was coming up. So it's interesting seeing those sort of connections. And Mark was interested in any way to get in the industry, writer, artist, whatever. And it was Grant who was like, pick one and really focus on that, because it is very difficult to make it as a master of both. And we all know a bunch of those names, but it is a smaller list of people. And Mark considered that some of the best advice he had gotten.
Absolutely. I believe he was I think he's barely turned 18. And by the time he's finished high school, he's already writing comic books professionally. He starts working on 2000 AD and some other kind of British projects. And he finally draws the eye of DC Comics and starts writing his first American comic book, Swamp Thing. First 4 issues, co-written by Grant Morrison, and you'll see that a lot throughout his career at the Big Two. The two collaborated quite a lot. And then he starts co-writing other titles with Morrison, including JLA and The Flash. So he kind of gets his first big mainstream exposure within DC Comics, working a lot with Grant Morrison.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of at like the height of Grant. I mean, Grant really exploded in that, like the very end of the 80s, like 89 into the early 2000s. I mean, I think people forget how much of a big hit, Batman Arkham Asylum was when that came out as an original graphic novel. That's really what got Grant like rich, like comic rich. I believe they got, like a 6-figure, low end 6-figure kind of, royalty from that pretty quickly, because their deal was something like $1 for every book that was sold at that time. It was crazy. So Mark, you don't want to say he lucked out necessarily in that exact way, but he was very lucky in the sense that Grant was willing to kind of take Mark under their wing and do this because, as popular as anyone is, you only have so much room and so much ability to bring someone up. And like you were saying, like Mark with, doing stuff at like 2000 AD, which was, again, very similar to how a lot of these people broke in, with like Grant and Allen and Warren Ellis and Brian Boland and, people like that. In a way, 2000 AD is kind of like the equivalent of like, in terms of like television comedians and movie comedians with like SCTV. Where it's like, oh, these people from this other country are really blow up, and then they come to America and do all these big things. So
I think that's where Liam Sharp was also discovered.
I believe so.
Yeah, absolutely. So he does all this work, Breen, kind of with his mentor Grant Morrison, and eventually he ends up replacing Warren Ellis on the Authority, while Wildstorm obviously is an imprint within DC Comics. You really start to see who Mark Millar is a writer that's very well thought of to this day. He ends up resigning from DC in 2001, but perhaps, not perhaps, his best known DC work ends up getting printed a couple years later in Red Sun, obviously, which he had written before he had departed. What are your thoughts on Red Sun? I've read that one. I think that is one of the most fascinating takes on Superman, and I do think it's a bit unfortunate that people don't realize that's supposed to be an alternate reality version of Superman, not a blueprint for Superman moving forward.
Yeah, I honestly am that one person who hasn't read that.
Wow.
So if Joe would like to elaborate on that for me.
Sure. No, it's in terms of like Elseworlds, it really stands tall. It's I don't know if it's my favorite Superman Elseworld. Probably not my favorite, but it's really well done. Obviously, it's people in terms of Superman Elseworlds, that's the only one anyone ever talks about. There was this one, I want to say it was like Kal-El, that was like an Arthurian, like medieval kind of one that Jose Luis Garcia Lopez illustrated. That's a favorite Elseworld of mine. Also,
Secret Identities. Yeah. Is it Secret Identity? Yeah, I think that was Elseworld. I like that one a lot too. It's like a different version of Superman. Yeah,
there's that one. Metropolis by Ted McKeever, which was a riff on the movie Metropolis blended into the Superman mythos. But yeah, as far as just people knowing the merchandise, I mean, there were times that would spike here and there where people were wearing the hammer and sickle Superman logo T-shirts. They made statues of the Red Sun Superman. They did an animated feature from DC of Red Sun. I did watch that. I've watched that animated movie more recently than I've read the story. But yeah, he had a profound sort of impact on people just through that one story. He's done random like fill-in things here and there for DC. Did a little bit of other Superman stories. He even did some I think a couple of Wonder Woman issues during like Eric Luke's run right before Phil Jimenez took over. Just some really interesting, he just wasn't hitting it at DC. But that happens a lot of times. There's a lot of times where you'll see a creator really excel at one place and it doesn't quite get the momentum somewhere else. And, unfortunately, like with his Swamp Thing run, despite
he was already getting ready to get canceled.
Yeah. I mean, it's not that well remembered, quality aside. Yeah. Swamp Thing's this property that a lot of people, they'll talk a big game, but at the same time, Grant wrote and, Mark, Brian K. Vaughan had a run on that book, and no one talks about any of their work on that series. It's interesting. But yeah, Mark would then go on and, like you were saying, stuff with the Authority, really forged a strong relationship with Frank Quitely that extends to this day. And, Frank Quitely will come up later in this video, I'm sure. And, despite all that, despite the great work in, with Wildstorm, the Authority, things like that, he really blew up with going to Marvel.
Absolutely. That happens in 2001, and he launches Ultimate X-Men under their Ultimate imprint, which obviously is kind of like another universe there. And he ends up collaborating eventually with Brian Hitch on the Ultimates, which is kind of the equivalent of the Avengers within the Ultimate Universe. Breen, I really like the Ultimates that Mark Millar did, but there's some crazy stuff going on there, and it's kind of his trademark, where he's willing to go a little bit darker with some of these characters, specifically when you think of Hank Pym and his relationship with Wasp in that book. We do get that really iconic Captain America look, and we get a reimagining of his origin that is actually transferred over kind of into the MCU. But I quite like the Ultimates. You do have to kind of you're like, man, I can't believe he made Hank Pym do that. So you got like Wasp like laying eggs in bed. He's shooting her with bug spray and stuff.
Yeah, I have not come to praise Millar, but to bury. There's a couple things to factor in here. By the time Millar did the Ultimates, the Avengers had fallen, even though Busiek was doing a great revival of the property at this time. If the Avengers had been more of a popular title at that time, I think it would have been called the Ultimate Avengers, but it was just called the Ultimates. It was basically go do whatever you want. You want to have the Hulk eat people, knock yourself out. You want to have why they're all running around seeking Freddie Prinze's approval, I don't know. It's just I wasn't the biggest fan of the Ultimates because it was just so bizarre. But I also know that the success he got off of that, he got to do something that really had only been done one other time, was when that's with Todd McFarlane. I believe they created a Spider-Man series for him, the Marvel Knights Spider-Man, that I believe started in 2003, 2004 with Terry and Rachel Dodson. Mm-hmm. And he did the first 12 issues of that. So, obviously he had something that they saw something in, and, that series continued on after him, but his, he had a pretty memorable 12-issue run. There was a Green Goblin story in there. And, you knew, he obviously had something that was clicking with Marvel readers, because they put him kind of on a rocket ship, and, that led to Civil War, which I'm sure we'll get to in a moment.
Absolutely. 2006 Civil War.
No,
you have something to add, Joe?
Yeah, no, it's funny because my brother James got a subscription to Ultimates. He was excited for that. He was 10 or 11 at the time. And he started getting into comics with things like Peter Milligan and Mike Allred on Ecstatics. I think it was still X-Force at the time. He was getting into it. But yeah, I remember he signed up for this subscription to get the issues mailed to the house. And he got it in time to get issue 1. So he was waiting, never got issue 1, thought that was weird. And then it started with issue 2. So he had, my mom had got him to write a letter and mail it in to let it know. And Marvel mails in issue 1, signed by Mark Millar. And James is all sad about it. And we're like, well, what's wrong? And he's like, well, he signed it. I can't read this now. I have to
it's a collectible.
Keep it and put it away. I wanted to read it.
That's hilarious. So, well, let's get into 2006. Obviously, Civil War ends up being adapted into a major motion picture as a Captain America film, and we see a lot of the stuff. There are a lot of elements within his Ultimates that are kind of adapted into those Avengers films, and certainly we'll get into Old Man Logan here in a second, where you start seeing that he might have the Midas touch when it comes to creating comic book stories that are adaptable and that are going to appeal to a wider range audience. I personally like Civil War. I know a lot of people have difference of opinions on this one, Joe. We get the Superhero Registration Act. We get the confrontation between Captain America and his side versus Tony Stark. Iron Man is this side. It's clear that Tony Stark is the villain, in my opinion, after reading the comic book. I don't know that Tony's ever really recovered, but I don't think that's really Mark Millar's fault. Sure. I think that's just the people that took up the mantle of the writing duties on Tony Stark afterward that didn't really know how to rehabilitate the character. But I think Civil War is amazing. You think about, you get the entire Marvel 616 fighting each other, like battling it out, and you get some memorable moments. I still think about Captain America with was it the Punishers that he ends up beating the snot out of, and they're like, why won't he fight back? It's like, because he looked up to Steve Rogers. That's why he went to Vietnam, kind of thing. And it was like, he could really make some great character moments as he's throwing in some of this crazy stuff that really you wouldn't expect to see in a Marvel comic.
No, absolutely. And, I'll let Brian touch on some of the bits with Civil War in a sec, but a couple of things I do want to touch on with Civil War is it was some of the best in terms of trade dress, some of the best that Marvel ever did. They did a great job at putting Civil War on all the tie-ins, all the books, the font, everything, and making sure it was always as high up on the issue as it could be, so you could, when you go to a shop, everything's stacked. A lot of times they have those wall displays where they cut off like half the issue or sometimes more, but they did a good job of making it easy for shops to display and get people to see everything that ties into Civil War. And unlike almost any other major event with this many tie-ins that Marvel's ever done, the amount of books shipping like oddly that would have like spoiled other books or delayed, and then was very minimal for an event that was a line-wide event like this. And I don't think they've been able to replicate that level of keeping it tight with that many books before. And when you
not for
look
lack
at
of trying, Joe, they've tried to do it.
They have tried, but in terms of actually really pulling it off, I believe there were only one or two titles that ended up being like just a little late that would have like spoiled something and all that. But they ended up doing a really great job in getting things out on time in a way that wasn't like spoiling things, and they were able to maneuver that around the core 7-issue miniseries, getting its delays and shifting things and getting it locked in. So I give them a lot of credit for that.
What are your thoughts on Civil War, Breed? You a fan?
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Okay, I promise that's my last literary quote. Okay, yes, I am. But maybe not for the reasons why other people maybe. Now, remember, I was coming at this having read Marvel Comics since the mid-'70s. So when you're talking about the issue where Cap's beating the hell out of Frank and he won't fight back because he respected Steve Rogers, well, where was that respect in Captain America 241 when Punisher was trying to kill him? Again, but when there's that many years of continuity, things are going to fall through the cracks. One of the things that really pissed me off when I read that was when Johnny Storm found out about what had happened in Stamford. His quote is, and this was Millar writing the book, "Who cares about a bunch of C-listers?" Well, one of those C-listers had been his girlfriend in the comics 1 year earlier. He might have cared a little bit. Now, that said, the Bill Jemas era did so much damage to the regular Marvel universe that the Ultimates were outselling the regular line. Jemas was famous for saying continuities for fanboys. Screw you, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, and Quesada tried to pull him out of that. You'd had House of M to this point, and then Civil War. Now, were there characters written horribly out of character? Absolutely. But the concept of it, and bear in mind, I said, the old Marvel that I knew from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that was gone. This was time to try something new. And on that level, I thought it worked very much. And I never really thought of Tony Stark as the villain of this piece because he had Reed and T'Challa firmly in his corner. it was. I mean, it was obviously it was an allegory. Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, whatever. I thought both sides were presented fairly even-handedly. I think you were supposed to root for Steve's bunch, but it wasn't so. I never thought of it as being so ham-fisted that you need to apologize if you sided with Tony. Now, that Civil War, the success of that, led to with the initiative into Secret Invasion, into Dark Reign, into Siege, which I thought creatively was as good a 5-year period as Marvel could have asked for. Maybe rivals even the first 5 years in an entirely different way because everything's been established at this point. And I'm not sure any of that happens if Civil War flops. So in that regard, Mark Millar is the reason why we got, that those 5 years of Marvel that I've championed, to this day, even though I know some of the aficionados do not agree with me on that, but I'm going to die on that hill. So I credit Mark Millar for that.
This is a real event where there's a real status quo change, and when it's over, the playground is shifted. There's new obstacles that you can use as a writer. And they're certainly very successful on Captain America and other books. Not as successful on Iron Man, in my opinion, but absolutely, Millar sets the table for an entire new way to do Marvel comics there for quite a while.
I got to disagree with you on Iron Man real quick. I thought Matt Fraction's run was spectacular on that. Everybody after him, I will give you.
Yeah, I actually enjoyed Fraction, especially early on. Like he really started that book with a bang, and I really appreciated them.
So we'll talk about his last work at Marvel that I want to hit on before we start talking about the Millarworld stuff. And this is another case where he has a concept, an idea, ends up being an enormous movie. It was the send-off of Wolverine on the big screen in Logan. It's his Old Man Logan storyline that appears in the Wolverine series. This thing has been, homage to death. They keep using these old man stories. You got an entire Old Man Logan series, the old man, old lady, old whatever, everywhere after this series, where you basically taking a dying Logan on his last days, in a dystopian future and really doing some cool things with him, Joe. But that was another game changer with Millar, in another case where he created an idea. It didn't translate perfectly to the big screen, but the idea and the concept itself really led to something really memorable outside, and certainly garners the eye of people outside of comics that maybe Mark Millar and the things that he creates are where you might want to invest in.
Yeah, and keep in mind too that both Civil War and Old Man Logan collaborated with Steve McNiven.
Doesn't hurt.
And and it was, it really changed a lot. Civil War brought us, for better or worse, into the event-driven era of Marvel that we're still trapped in. And Old Man Logan, again, very successful. Both of these, they, used for movies that they were adapting pretty directly. Made a lot of changes, but still. And like you're saying, it was just so popular. It would have been hard to imagine before Old Man Logan anyone pitching something like, what these kids would love? What if Hawkeye was old? What if Black Widow was old? What if Peter Quill was old? It's that's the whole pitch. And it's crazy. It is crazy that you could do a book titled that and not only have them go in really weird directions with who they use with that old man bit, but that when they killed off Wolverine later on, or Charles Soule killed Wolverine, but after that they brought in Old Man Logan for a bit to kind of be the replacement, in addition to X-23, Laura, all that. But you had the Old Man Logan. It was why'd you even kill Wolverine if you were able to bring in so many other Wolverines to fill the void? And then you brought him back anyway, because I guess there weren't enough Wolverines. that's not Mark's fault. But yeah, no, Old Man Logan was definitely a game changer, and
we're getting the Wastelanders this year. 5
Yeah.
one-shots, all set in the Old Man universe. It's been 12 years.
Yeah.
They're still doing it, Joe. So.
No, absolutely. And I mean, people still talk about it. That's one of those like evergreen trades at this point that people come into a shop and, you know, maybe they're just getting into characters like Wolverine, and that's just one that's on the top of a lot of people's lists.
So while all this is going on, we see Mark Millar starts setting the table of where he is today. In 2004, he announces Millarworld. It's his own creator-owned line where he's going to be, you know, independently publishing these comics, and it's going to be an ownership split 50-50 with the comic book artist, which turns out is a very good tool for end up collaborating with the best artists. You talked about continuing to work with Frank Quitely, Stuart Eminem, and a lot of other comic artists still work almost exclusively with Millar to this day. But in that time, you know, he's got, you know, Civil War coming out, Old Man Logan, and a bunch of other stuff. But he also releases a book called Wanted, which clearly stars as Eminem in a comic book, ends up being adapted to a film. Then he also has Kick-Ass, also adapted into a film. And then, you know, he ends up leaving Marvel full time and writing his own comic books. He ends up getting a lot of big comics you're going to recognize: Nemesis, Superior, Super Crooks, Kingsman, Secret Service, Kick-Ass 2, Hit Girl, Kick-Ass 3, Jupiter's Legacy, Jupiter's Circle, Starlight, MPH, Huck, Chrononauts, Empress, Reborn. A lot of those things have all been adapted and been very successful in one medium or another, Joe. I mean, that's where it is.
Yeah, and I had the pleasure of getting a chance to see both Kick-Ass and Kingsman in the theaters, which was fun. And, you know, he got to work with artists like JR as well. You know, Olivier Copiel he's working with now, you know, Sean Murphy, like lots of real heavy hitting artists, Greg Capullo. Yeah, the list really goes on. For me, Starlight's probably my favorite that he did of those. I've read most of them. I haven't read all the titles you mentioned, you know, but I read the majority of them, and Starlight was the one that really stood out for me. But I'm a sucker for like old timey sci-fi, and yeah, like Buck Rogers and stuff like that. So it's a bit of a mark, but I think that one really stands out and has a lot of heart to it. It's weird. Sometimes you get the Mark Millar with heart that can even pull at your heartstrings a little bit, and sometimes you get the very just dark, super sarcastic, edgy Mark. You know, I mean, we completely blew past the unfunnies, for example, but yeah.
So, Breen, I know you're also a fan of Starlight, correct?
Yeah, yeah. It's weird when you laid all that out. You know, of all the things he's done that have been adapted, kind of reminds me of, you know, Alan Moore and Frank Miller did stories that were just supposed to be that stories, but then everybody that came after them tried to be Alan Moore and Frank Miller to varying degrees of success, but in some cases to the detriment of the industry. Now, you know, with Mark Millar, I think he's the guy that kind of ushered in the era of, you know, it used to be writing for the trades. Now it's writing for the Netflix pitch. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, most people that try that ain't Mark Millar.
They aren't there.
So, you know, for all the good that it's done, there's also that. But as far as Starlight, I have an analogy that kind of goes back to a retrospective we recently did.
Cool.
There was a story in the X-Men where Magneto built a ship out of nothing but wood, no metal, just to prove he could. I look at Starlight as that one series Mark Millar did without any of the Millerisms, without any of the snark, without any of the the things that you need to take a shower after you read, just to prove he could.
Yeah.
And like Joe, that's my favorite of his creator-owned stuff too.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. I saw it. You know, obviously, I saw Kick-Ass I saw the movie. I was like, I should read that comic book. Well, that's certainly adapted, but man, you go from Kick-Ass the movie to Kick-Ass the Mark Millar comic book. Woo, this is a little bit different, Joe. Like,
yes,
the character's not quite as things aren't going quite as well for him. There's some rough stuff in there that you got to experience to go read that comic book.
Oh yeah, no, it's a brutal book, but a lot of his creator-owned stuff is brutal. I mean, Nemesis is another one that gets pretty brutal, But yeah, and he does these interesting takes. But even like building on some of what Eric was saying, like writing for the Netflix pitch, all of his pitches like that are like these series are pretty easy to pitch or describe to people. And, like Nemesis is kind of like, what if, Bruce Wayne was the villain, like that kind of thing. And it's like, it's an easy, digestible pitch. And I think what a lot of people end up doing when they try to copy that is they try to get so clever with their pitch that it's impossible to easily describe to someone.
It's
they're trying to do
impenetrable
too many things.
to actually realize what they're actually doing.
Yeah, because I think you see that a lot now, and like the, in DC and even like Image Comics and stuff like that, where it's like, okay, it's like, it's the far future, but there's like a crisis here and there's kaiju. And then also and you're just like, what are you talking about? But like with this stuff, it's very easy. It's like, Kingsman. What if we, updated James Bond? Done.
The whole class,
like, it's just
dapper superheroes for the next generation.
Yeah. So I think that is also part of Mark's success.
Well, it certainly ends up leading to a very lucrative deal in 2017. Netflix purchases Millarworld from him for a large sum of money. It has been undisclosed, but I can't even imagine just how big it was. But he has this big deal with Netflix. That is the dream, essentially, for every comic book creator. It feels like now, Breen, for better or worse. And I don't blame them. You want your work to transcend the medium. You want to have opportunities to go out there and tell your stories to bigger audiences. And what bigger audience really is there than Netflix? Everybody, you watch the damn thing on your phone, watch it on your tablet, watch it on your TV, and it's definitely he has left an indelible impact. I think everybody wishes they could be Mark Millar, but like you said earlier, not everybody can do that, Eric.
Yeah, it's a disservice to the comic book hobby that a lot of people that don't have the ability try. And maybe the term "stay in your lane" might apply to some of these people that instead of giving us great comic book stories, they're writing towards like, oh God, I got to do this crap until I get my Netflix deal. And they forget that's, it doesn't always work that way. A lot of times, the best things happen that, it happens organically. Cause I'm sure that I doubt Mark Millar had a 9-figure Netflix deal in mind when he started his first story like that. It just happened. And unfortunately that doesn't, nor can it work for everybody.
Yeah.
So, great for him, and if there were more creators out there that just looked at the comic book medium as someplace they would like to be, more of them would probably come up with things that would be noticed by people that they could use then as a platform, a stepping stone to get where they ultimately want to be.
Yeah. That's kind of one of the things I've noticed, Joe. You'll have a better insight on this, but it almost feels like a lot of creators nowadays, especially on the independent scene, they're almost dumbing down the comic book medium to make it more translatable. And I've never really gotten that impression with Millar's work. It's like, yeah, if you want to adapt it, you're going to have to work because it is not going to work exactly on the big screen. But this is what I was able to do with comic books, and the heart of the story is there. That the story beats are everything there. It is translatable, but you're going to have to work for it. It's not fully ready, ready for prime time as far as streaming or television or movies.
No, for sure. And I mean, part of that too is you read a lot of Mark's stuff, and you're like, he's not being like budget conscious. It's not like he's not trying to be like, let's make sure this can be done with like $10 million or less. Like, there's none of that to it.
We don't want this to go rated R. Don't put too much blood. You know what I mean? Don't get too gory. It's like, no, you want to adapt it, you're going to have to work for it.
Yeah. So I think that's important. And yeah, no, nothing he's read has ever felt, despite how cynical maybe that some of the characters and the content itself is, it's never read as a like cynical move to just get something adapted. You know, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that's like one of the lessons that it hasn't been learned. Like, well, you can make these stories that can be adapted, but you have to use the medium to the fullest so that story will garner the most eyes and the most acclaim, and then people will notice it. If you dumb it down and you don't use the comic medium to the fullest, like you're almost selling yourself short as a storyteller. And I think that's one of the unfortunate byproducts. So that's certainly not Mark Millar's fault, because he never did that. They just forgot to learn every lesson.
Yeah. No. It's yeah, but no, and yeah, it's incredible some of the work he's been able to put out. Him and Grant, as we were talking about earlier. We'll just address this quickly because I'm sure there are going to be people in the comments, potentially who might bring it up. Like, they've sort of had like their own falling out and don't really collaborate anymore. So unless you're Frank Quitely, who seamlessly works with both of them, no problem. But yeah, I don't know all the details. I don't really care. It's none of my business, but yeah, it is interesting seeing those sort of, relationships and collaborations and how they come and go in comics. It's certainly not even the biggest or most dramatic fallout, so it is what it is.
Very interesting career, and I think the blueprint that I think a lot of people today would like to emulate. You go in there, you make a bang at the big two, you garner some real big interest, you get some big sales, you move off to your own platform, create your own IP, and hopefully it moves on to bigger and better things, and you basically become your own brand. Yeah. Very hard to replicate. But I think this is the plan that people are looking for, rather than the Todd McFarlane. I create an IP and I put everything that I can behind it, and maybe move outside and do toys or something else as well. Yeah. Very interesting that people have chosen this path. Breen, do you have any final words about Mark Millar and his career so far?
Yeah, an amazing creator who's had an amazing career. And I would just caution people that try to follow in his footsteps. Maybe more Kirby Crackle and less writing for a Crackle budget.
Very, very well said. Joe, do you have any final words about Mark Millar and his impact on comic books?
No, yeah. I mean, his impact is gigantic. We might not have had like the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the same way without what he did, since they did mine a lot of elements and attitudes of characters and stuff like that for the MCU. It does kind of make you wish we had a little bit more of what he would have done at DC had they have done more to keep him on there. I don't know if it would have worked or resonated in the same way. It's possible it wouldn't have, and it would have ended up kneecapping his career. But it would have been interesting to see his take on some of those other characters, but yeah, if you're not familiar with Mark, I'd be shocked. It would probably mean that you're somewhere between having been a fan and dropping off by like the 90s, or just getting into comics. Other than that, I'd have a hard time believing you're not familiar with Mark in some fashion.
Might not, if they didn't know it, they just don't realize it. Like, you've seen The Kingsman, you've seen Kick-Ass, you've seen Civil War.
Yeah,
you don't even realize all that was just mined from him.
Yeah, no, for sure. So yeah, he's an interesting creator. People should at least be aware of some of his work. And if you've never read it, check it out.
You see some crazy stuff.
There is some crazy stuff, but what Bree and I were saying before, if you're like, look, I wouldn't mind giving Mark a shot, but I'd like something that isn't so upsetting and grotesque that I couldn't read it on like a train or a bus or somewhere in public, Starlight might be more your speed.
That might be the entry point. It's a good place to be. Mark Millar has fuck you money. He could do whatever he wants. So hey, if he wants to go to DC and tell some stories, he can write his own check. You know what I mean? He can literally do whatever he wants. I think that's what we all want in our life, to be in a position like Mark Millar, where you can, you basically write your own check and do what you want. So I do want to say thank you very much to Eric Braid and Joe Corallo for joining me today, talk about the career of Mark Millar. Obviously, we'll be back next week talking about another stellar career from a comic book creator. Thank you all very much.
Yep, thanks.
You guys ready to talk about Mark Millar?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
It's Mark Millar, right?
It is Mark Millar, yes.
Everyone always does that Millar thing. Purchase always screw me up with the names. He does it on purpose.
Oh, no, he absolutely does. Because, I think not only have I told him, but other people have told him, like, it's Millar. And then he'll still do that bit of,
It's not just him. It's like every name he messes up on purpose just to mess me up. Because I'm like, I start questioning myself. Was I saying that wrong the whole time?
Yeah, but yeah, that is Millar.
Yeah, it's like Perch's diabolical plan, like coming together. I'm gonna have everybody mispronouncing names the rest of the time.
Yeah,
jeez,
absolutely.
If he ate more Arby's, he'd probably be able to pronounce more
He'd
names.
be a happier person, and he'd be scheming less. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.